The crowd laughed first, high, cruel laughter that bounced off the brick walls of the courthouse square. The woman at the center of it didn't flinch. They said her name was Dinah, though that wasn't the name her mother gave her. On a humid morning in June 1841, she stood on a wooden block in Natchez, Mississippi, wrists bound in iron, sunlight sharp enough to make the air shimmer. The smell was a mixture of sweat, tobacco, and horses. Beneath it all, fear like copper on the tongue. The stakes couldn't be higher. In a world where ownership was mistaken for order, a single woman's silence or defiance could mean the difference between life and death. Dinah's master, Josiah Fitch, was a tall man gone soft around the edges, his white linen suit yellowing with age and arrogance. He'd lost more than half his cotton crop that spring to boll weevils, but still strutted across the platform like a rooster, pretending his power hadn't already begun to rot. When the auctioneer barked her weight and age, Josiah interrupted, saying she was used but well-trained, drawing laughter from the men below. But Dinah didn't look at them. She looked past them, to the courthouse clock striking 11, to the boy on the edge of the crowd biting his lip, to the woman fanning herself too quickly. She saw the things other people missed. That was her gift. That, and her memory. June the 15th, 1841, sold again. The Lord must tire of counting. Fragment found in Dinah's Bible, archived at the Mississippi State Historical Society. They say humiliation burns hottest when mixed with truth. As Josiah raised his hand to display her like livestock, Dinah tilted her chin and began to laugh. It wasn't loud, just sharp enough to cut through the chatter. The laughter stopped. "You find something funny, girl?" Josiah asked, his voice hardening. Dinah answered quietly, "Just wondering if they'll take payment in lies." A few in the crowd chuckled, uneasy, not sure if it was allowed. Josiah stepped closer, sneer spreading. "You think you're clever?" Dinah's eyes met his. "I think you owe half these men money." Gasps rippled through the square like wind through dry grass. She spoke in a measured tone, each word deliberate, naming names, dates, amounts. The blacksmith who'd lent Josiah $20 last harvest. The merchant's wife he'd been seen visiting after dark. The preacher who'd received forged deeds for a property near the river. Every accusation was a spark, and the crowd caught fire. People leaned closer, whispering, glancing at each other, confirming details they already suspected but had never dared to say. Josiah's face drained of color. "Shut her up," he barked, but the auctioneer hesitated, because even he owed Josiah money. The sound of murmuring grew louder, rising into something almost physical. Dinah stood perfectly still, the way a tree stands before lightning finds it. She wasn't supposed to know these things. She wasn't supposed to speak, but plantation kitchens have thin walls, and servants see everything. A man in the crowd shouted, "Is it true, Fitch? Did you cheat Reverend Pruitt?" Another voice followed, "And the bank in Vicksburg?" Josiah's jaw trembled. He reached for her arm, but Dinah jerked free so violently the iron links rattled. That sound, metal against wood, cut through the noise like a warning bell. Her laughter returned, louder this time, carrying an edge that no one could mistake for madness. "What are you going to sell me for, Josiah?" she said, voice rising over the chaos. "Same price as your conscience?" For a moment, no one moved. The auctioneer cleared his throat, but said nothing. Even the horses seemed to still. Dinah's eyes scanned the crowd, men sweating through their collars, women clutching parasols like weapons, children whispering questions they'd never get answers to. The silence stretched so long it began to shake. Then, a slap, open-handed, sharp. Josiah's blow caught her across the mouth. Blood welled on her lip. Still, she smiled. Somewhere in the back, a woman whispered, "Lord help us. She's not afraid." And that was when the fear shifted. Not Dinah's, theirs, because every person there suddenly understood that the performance had changed roles. The master was on display now. The sheriff stepped forward uncertainly. "That's enough, Fitch." But it wasn't. Josiah was unraveling, shouting over the crowd, insisting it was all lies, that she was nothing but property. Yet every denial drew more attention, more doubt. And Dinah, bleeding, bound, standing on a block of splintered wood, had never looked more free. She said one last thing before they dragged her away. Ask him about the letter he sent to New Orleans, the one signed not by him, but by me. The gasp this time wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Even those who'd never learned to read understood exactly what that meant. For the first time in years, Josiah Fitch had no words. The courthouse bell tolled 12. Noon light burned across the square, catching the dust that hung like smoke after a fire. And as the crowd turned on him, questions, accusations, debts, Dinah was led away down the alley toward the jailhouse, her laughter echoing off the walls. What had she written? And how had a woman with no rights managed to destroy a man with everything? One truth had already surfaced. Power, once mocked, doesn't forget. And in Mississippi, power always strikes back. The silence after laughter is always the loudest. Midnight crept through the jailhouse like a thief. Iron bars hummed faintly as the river wind slipped between them, carrying the smells of damp straw, whiskey, and the sour sweetness of rotting wood. The only light came from a lantern swinging outside the sheriff's office, painting gold streaks across the floor. Dinah sat, upright against the wall, wrists still cuffed. Her lips were split, her cheek bruised, but her eyes, those were steady. She was thinking, not suffering. The stakes had grown even higher. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was a living scandal, and every man in town had something to lose if she spoke again. Sheriff Abram Greeley was not a cruel man by local standards. He'd seen whippings, auctions, hangings, all part of what folks called the order of things. But something about the way Josiah Fitch had crumbled that afternoon unsettled him. A man of means, humiliated in front of half the county? That sort of thing left cracks in the foundation. At 12:30, he unlocked Dinah's cell. "You'll have to answer some questions," he said, holding the lantern low. Dinah didn't look up. "Questions don't change truth, Sheriff." He studied her for a long moment. "You wrote a letter. Where is it?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't." Her calm unnerved him. He'd expected defiance or begging, not quiet certainty. "People are saying you forged documents, letters with your master's name." "Not forged," she said softly. "Just finished what he started." That line would echo through Natchez for decades. County Jail Inventory, June 17, 1841. One female Negro, 30 years of age, one torn shawl, one piece of charcoal, one folded paper hidden under straw. Sheriff Greeley's logbook, archived in Adams County records when he found it. Tucked beneath a patch of straw, wrapped in fabric. He expected nonsense. But the letter bore Josiah Fitch's seal, perfectly pressed. The handwriting was identical to his own. It was a contract. A confession disguised as business correspondence. It detailed illegal land transactions, bribes to overseers, and debt transfers to names that didn't exist. At the bottom, Next to Josiah's false signature was another name written in a neat, looping hand. Dinah Fitch. She had written herself into ownership. The sheriff set the paper down slowly. If this gets out? It already has, Dinah interrupted. And that was true. A copy, made by a sympathetic clerk, was already making its way upriver toward Vicksburg, bound for the office of a federal debt investigator. Sheriff Greeley exhaled. You realize what he'll do to you when he finds out? Dinah's answer came after a long pause. He already did everything he could. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was verdict. What would you have done standing in that cell? Would you destroy the letter to save her, or deliver it to preserve the law? Outside, Natchez was still awake. Rumors ran through the taverns like wildfire. Merchants argued over unpaid notes. The preacher's wife fainted at Sunday service when someone mentioned the letter. Fitch locked himself in his study, refusing visitors, burning papers late into the night. Power unraveling, reputation catching flame. But even as Fitch tried to crush the scandal, he couldn't undo what she'd done. Dinah's letter had exposed not only his crimes, but the machinery behind his wealth, the system that made slavery profitable, fragile, and hypocritical. Every page was an indictment, every sentence a mirror. And for the first time, white men in Natchez found themselves whispering the same question. If a slave could write like that, what else might she be capable of? Sheriff Greeley kept the original letter locked in a metal drawer beneath his desk. But the next morning, when he went to check, the drawer was empty, the lock untouched. All that remained was a scrap of paper on his desk, written in that same precise hand. You can't chain words, Sheriff. By noon, Dinah was gone. The official story said she was transferred to a holding wagon bound for Jackson, but no guard recalled seeing her leave. The iron cuffs were still on the floor of her cell, unlocked. No one could explain it. Some said she'd bribed the deputy with promises of Fitch's hidden money. Others whispered she'd walked through the walls, same way she'd walked through the man who once owned her. That night, the sky over Natchez turned the color of rust as a storm rolled in from the river. The next morning, Josiah Fitch's housekeeper found him unconscious in his study. His ledger books were gone, his safe open, and on his desk, laid neatly beside an extinguished candle, was his personal seal. Pressed into wax was a single line of writing: debt paid in full. The sheriff rode out to the Fitch plantation that afternoon. The fields were silent, the slaves huddled in the quarters, too afraid to speak. A woman said she'd seen Dinah walking toward the levee before sunrise, carrying nothing but a folded shawl. The river, she said, didn't take her. It bowed around her. That detail would haunt Sheriff Greeley for years. When he returned to town, he found the courthouse steps covered in notices, debts recalled, properties reclaimed, a dozen lawsuits filed against Josiah Fitch. The man who'd laughed so loudly at the auction was now a pariah. And the woman who'd once stood beneath his boot, she had vanished into rumor. Justice, people began to say, had changed its handwriting. Words are the sharpest chains. Morning came thick and humid, the air already trembling with the weight of another southern summer. The levee was alive with sound, the slow churn of steamboats, the rhythmic grunt of men rolling cotton bales, the hiss of water against wooden hulls. Tar and molasses scented the air. And walking through it all, wrapped in a faded shawl, was a woman no one dared to stop. Dinah. Her gait was measured, unhurried. The same woman who'd been dragged to auction in chains now walked among merchants and traders, as if she owned the river itself. Because in a way, she did. This was her escape route. The artery of the South, the Mississippi, that long, slow witness to every human sin. Somewhere along its muddy banks, she had arranged for a boat that didn't exist on any manifest. The man waiting for her was a free black pilot named Elijah Turner, a conductor for what people in hushed tones called the Southern Line. He recognized her before she even reached the dock. "You sure you want this?" he asked quietly. "Ain't no turning back once we push off." Dinah's reply was simple. "Ain't been no turning back since I was born." The stakes sharpened here, because freedom wasn't just about leaving. It was about what she intended to do with that freedom. They pushed off at 8:30 a.m., the paddle wheel groaning like an old animal. The river reflected a bruised sky. Elijah steered them northward toward Vicksburg, where a handful of abolitionist lawyers worked quietly under assumed names. Dinah stayed below deck, hands clasped around a cloth pouch that held something more valuable than gold. Documents she'd forged in Josiah Fitch's own hand. But here's the twist. She wasn't running away to disappear. She was running to finish the ruin she'd started. Vicksburg Port Log, June 19, 1841. Unregistered vessel sighted at dawn, bearing no flag. One woman disembarked before inspection. Description, medium height, scar on wrist, wearing gray shawl. No further trace. The river swallowed secrets easily. By noon, Fitch's estate back in Natchez had begun to collapse under its own weight. Creditors arrived in carriages. Foremen demanded wages. Rumors spread that his ledgers were forgeries, that the banknotes he'd issued weren't backed by any cotton at all. One merchant was overheard saying, "The man's empire was built on the same lies he told that woman." A fitting symmetry. Meanwhile, Dinah moved through Vicksburg's crowded streets like a ghost. Head down, steps deliberate. Every few blocks, she'd pause near a church or a tailor's shop and slip an envelope into the hands of someone waiting. Inside each was a single document stamped with Josiah Fitch's seal. Official manumission papers, granting freedom to people he'd never intended to release. Names crossed off a ledger, lives rewritten in ink. Within a week, at least 9 enslaved people were reported missing from plantations between Natchez and Port Gibson. All carried papers that appeared genuine, and all bore the same signature. His. How much of this was planned, and how much was instinct? How far can one person bend a system before it snaps back? By the time word of her actions reached Sheriff Greeley, it was too late. She'd already vanished again, leaving behind a trail of bureaucratic chaos. For weeks, steamboats were stopped and searched, and rumors flared that she was traveling under the alias Mrs. Fitch, a widow from Louisiana. That name carried power. Doors opened, papers went unstamped, men looked away. One tavern owner swore he'd seen her sitting in the corner booth of the Riverlight Inn, reading a newspaper by lamplight. She looked like she belonged there, he told the investigator later. That's what scared me most. Power wears many disguises. In Natchez, Josiah Fitch's creditors seized his estate. His house was gutted, his fields abandoned, his name whispered only in curses. Witnesses said he took to drinking heavily, haunting the courthouse steps, muttering about ghosts and letters that rewrote themselves. A month later, his body was found face down near the levee, clutching a half-burned piece of paper. Only 2 words were legible. "You're welcome." The coroner called it suicide. Others called it justice. Back in Vicksburg, a new rumor took shape. A woman had been seen teaching letters to the children of freedmen in a ramshackle schoolhouse near the edge of town. She wore gloves even in the heat, and her handwriting was said to be elegant as lace. Some said she was a teacher from New Orleans. Others whispered she'd once been owned by a man named Fitch. No one knew for certain. But the records from that year, marriage licenses, property deeds, freedom papers, all show the same peculiar quirk, a certain looping F that appeared nowhere else before or after 1841. History leaves fingerprints. Truth writes itself in ink and blood. As the summer dragged on, Southern papers began to connect the dots. Missing slaves, forged documents, a dead planter, and a woman who seemed to move through walls. One editorial in the Mississippi Free Press warned, "If even one slave can master the pen, the South will fall not to rebellion, but to revision." By late July, bounty hunters began their search in earnest. Posters appeared offering $200 for her capture, alive only. But one witness in Vicksburg swore he'd seen her boarding a mail steamer bound for Memphis, dressed in mourning black, head bowed like a grieving widow. The boat's name? The Magnolia Belle? And by the time it reached Memphis, there was no trace of her on board. Only a single folded page left on a passenger seat, the ink still wet. Stop laughing. Memphis, 1841. A humid dusk settled over the city like a fever. The streets near the riverfront were thick with wagon ruts and the smell of horse sweat. Steamers lined the docks, their paddle wheels sighing as crews loaded cargo. Amid the noise and smoke, a single letter began to move through the world. One page, folded twice, passed from hand to hand like a secret too heavy to hold. It had been found on the Magnolia Belle, tucked beneath a passenger's seat, addressed to no one. But the words on that page burned through the South like wildfire. You think you own history. You don't. I've taken your words and written them back in truth. Stop laughing. At first, no one understood it. Then came the signatures. Plantation ledgers in Natchez, legal documents in Vicksburg, even courthouse deeds in Jackson, all with identical handwriting and identical seals. Somehow, someone had rewritten Josiah Fitch's power into something unrecognizable. The letter landed on the desk of Judge Samuel Barron, a staunch defender of Southern law. He called it a dangerous fraud. But the words stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, across the river in Arkansas, a man named Elijah Turner, the same pilot who'd ferried Dinah to Vicksburg, was questioned by federal marshals. He refused to speak, but one witness said that before they took him away, he whispered, "She's not running anymore. She's rewriting." That's when the investigation shifted. Suddenly, this wasn't about a fugitive slave. It was about a ghostwriter. Someone was altering official documents at every level of Southern bureaucracy, replacing lies with truth. Manumissions appeared where there had been bills of sale. Birth records of enslaved children now listed both parents, sometimes even ownership nullified. Each forgery was flawless. Each signature matched, and each one carried a date. June 19th, 1841, Juneteenth, the same day Dinah vanished. The panic spread fast. Bankers double-checked their ledgers. Lawyers tore apart their archives. One terrified clerk in Jackson claimed he'd seen a woman in gray slipping through the courthouse after hours. When he called out, she turned and said, "You can't unwrite what's already true." That line would later appear word for word in a sermon by a freed preacher in Ohio. By August, the Memphis Chronicle was publishing serialized reports on the mystery, calling it the Gray Widow Affair. The papers described her as half specter, half avenger, a woman as dangerous with a pen as any man with a gun. One editorial said, If she is real, she has done what no army could, turn the law against itself. And yet, despite the growing fear, something else began to happen. In the corners of taverns, in the quarters of plantation fields, in whispered songs at night, her name became a story. Mothers told their children, "She's the one who writes freedom into the books." A myth was being born, but the government wasn't done. Agents traced the forgeries back to a specific brand of ink, imported from New Orleans, used only by one printer, Fitch and Sons Publishing, now abandoned since Josiah's death. When they raided the building, they found presses still stained with black ink, scattered parchment, and a series of drafts written in the same looping script. Truth will not hide forever. Names matter. I am still learning how to be free. There was no body, no fingerprints, only one clue, an open Bible on the desk, with a verse underlined in red. Isaiah 10:1. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees. The agents burned everything, but one of them, years later, confessed in a private letter that before they set the fire, he found something tucked in the drawer, a folded page, faintly water-stained, written in the same hand. Tell them I didn't run. Tell them I wrote. And below that, a single signature. Dinah Fitch, the name of her master claimed as her own. It was a declaration, a rebirth, and a curse all at once. By the winter of 1841, the South was in quiet chaos. Ledgers couldn't be trusted. Bills of sale disappeared. Some slaveholders claimed their property was vanishing by pen. The law tried to erase her existence, but the damage was irreversible. Even the Natchez Courier published an uneasy headline: "The pen has become the new rebellion." And that's when reports started emerging from the North. Letters arriving in abolitionist offices bearing the same looping F. Inside were names, dates, and hidden routes along the river, all meticulously written by hand. Whoever Dinah Fitch was now, she'd become more than a fugitive. She was an author of unrest, and soon, Washington would have to decide. Was she a criminal, or the first historian of the enslaved? Vicksburg, Mississippi, December 1841. A storm had rolled in from the Gulf, pressing the sky down until it touched the rooftops. Rain hissed against brick and tin, and thunder shook the shutters of every house on Main Street. By dawn, the river had risen high enough to swallow the lower wharves. No one in town spoke above a whisper that morning, as if the weather itself had brought bad news. Then came the silence. The bells of St. Paul's usually tolled at 7. They didn't that day. Inside the courthouse, a clerk found the door to the records room unlatched. He lit his lantern and froze. Every ledger on the shelves had been opened and rearranged. Pages fluttered like white feathers. But what chilled him most was the smell: burnt wax and lavender oil. On the table sat a single quill, blackened at the tip, next to a candle that had burned itself out. And on the wall, drawn in the soot, 3 words: "Stop laughing now." By noon, half the town had heard. By evening, every tavern was full of whispers about the Gray Widow. Someone said she'd been seen walking near the docks in a gray cloak, her hands gloved, carrying a bundle of papers tied with red twine. Another claimed to have heard singing from the steamboat graveyard, a woman's voice, humming an old river song about freedom and fire. But not everyone was afraid. In the saloon across from the old post office, a group of men were drinking whiskey and laughing about the rumors. One of them, a cotton broker named Leland Hunt, slammed his fist on the bar and said, "If she's real, she's nothing but a thief with ink on her hands. The world's gone mad over a runaway woman." The bartender didn't answer. He just stared at the mirror behind the bottles, because reflected in it, for a brief second, was the outline of a woman standing in the doorway. When he turned, she was gone. The storm broke again that night, harder than before. Lightning struck the courthouse roof and split the bell tower clean in two. The fire spread fast, devouring the records room. People ran through the streets shouting, but no one saw who started it, or if it had started on its own. In the ashes the next morning, they found something half-burned but legible. Every lie you write is tinder, and beneath it, a single fingerprint in black wax. The sheriff called it vandalism, but the judges knew better. Fitch's estate was already bankrupt. His creditors were turning on each other, and the letters that had begun as whispers were now being reprinted in abolitionist pamphlets up north, titled The Testimony of Dinah Fitch. What began as humiliation in an auction square had become a contagion of truth. But what frightened the powerful most wasn't the documents, it was the stories. Servants spoke of a woman who appeared at kitchen doors, offering a pouch of ink and saying, "Write your name where they can't erase it." Others swore she'd been seen teaching children their letters in the moonlight, tracing alphabets in river sand. Was she real, or had she become an idea? By early January, the governor ordered a full inquiry. Men with badges swept through Vicksburg, searching homes and confiscating papers. One witness, a preacher named Amos Riley, refused to surrender a letter written in the same familiar hand. He was jailed for contempt. The next morning, the jail was empty. No broken locks, no footprints, only a folded note left on the bench. Freedom isn't stolen, it's written. 3 days later, the Mississippi Gazette published an anonymous editorial. When the law serves injustice, the ink will rebel. No one claimed authorship, but every typesetter in town recognized the punctuation style, an extra space before every dash. It was Dinah's mark. That week, every printing press from Memphis to Natchez mysteriously jammed for a full day. One foreman later said, "The gears just stopped turning, like the whole South forgot how to speak." He wasn't far off. By spring, the town that once laughed at a woman on the auction block no longer made jokes about her. Traders spoke in code, judges locked their doors, and even the auctioneers, men who'd built fortunes with their voices, found their throats tight when they tried to announce a sale. It was as if the very act of naming ownership had turned to ash in their mouths. And somewhere, in a house by the river that smelled faintly of lavender and soot, a candle burned low beside a ledger filled with rewritten names. Each one ended the same way: freed by hand, not by law. What happens when truth becomes contagious? Spring, 1842. The Mississippi River ran high that year, so high that it swallowed fence lines, carried away livestock, and turned fields into mirrors of brown glass. At night, the frogs sang like a warning, and people swore they saw lights moving along the levee, lanterns that vanished when approached. The townsfolk whispered that the gray widow was walking again, carrying her ledger beneath her shawl. But this time, she wasn't alone. Freedom leaves echoes. A group of freedwomen from Natchez had begun calling themselves the Ink Sisters. Seamstresses, cooks, and laundresses by day, they met after sundown in back rooms lit by whale oil lamps, copying the letters that had once destroyed their master's name. They didn't know the woman's face, only her handwriting. Each curl of her G, each slant of her S, that was their gospel. They wrote on scraps of paper, on cloth, even on walls when paper ran short. Their goal wasn't revenge, it was record. Every name of every soul sold or stolen, written down before the memory could fade. "Paper lasts longer than chains," one of them said. A single candle flickered in that dark room, its flame dancing like a heartbeat. But word of their gatherings spread, and in a place where ink could topple fortunes, a pen was more dangerous than a pistol. One humid night in May, the sheriff led a raid on a tailor's shop rumored to host the secret meetings. The door was kicked open, ink bottles shattered, papers scattered like feathers in a storm. They found only one person inside, a girl of 15, trembling with ink-stained fingers. Her name was Lucille. When questioned, she said quietly, "I'm just copying names." The sheriff laughed, thinking she meant a school lesson. "Whose names?" She lifted her chin. "Everyone you forgot." The room went silent. They arrested her, of course. But that night, before she could be moved to the county jail, lightning struck the sheriff's barn, setting the place ablaze. Amid the chaos, Lucille vanished. The only thing left in her cell was a single line written in soot across the wall. "You can't cage a story." By now, even the governor's men were unsettled. They'd burned papers, raided houses, questioned preachers, but the writing kept returning. In fields, on fences, carved into courthouse benches. Always the same phrase, "Stop laughing." The phrase that started it all. The line that had turned humiliation into uprising. But where was Dinah Fitch? Had she fled north? Had she died? Or was she moving through these towns like smoke, impossible to hold? A letter dated June 11, 1842, from a Union sympathizer in Ohio, provides one of the last known clues. "A woman of refined speech and uncommon bearing came through our station last month. She carried no baggage, only a folded page and a quill wrapped in cloth. When asked her name, she said, 'I've had many, but tonight I am the ink.' She stayed one night and left before dawn. The handwriting of that letter, same spacing before every dash. The same as Dinah's. So the question became not where she was, but what she had become. Historians would later debate whether the movement that swept across the Mississippi Valley that summer was coordinated or coincidental. Between June and August, 12 plantation offices mysteriously burned. 4 ledgers were stolen from courthouse vaults, and in every one of those towns, witnesses reported seeing the same thing. A woman standing near the flames, silent, watching as the smoke rose. Then she would vanish. The authorities called it sabotage. The enslaved called it a cleansing. Even some poor white farmers, those bankrupted by the same men Dinah had exposed, started whispering her name with respect. "She made them choke on their own laughter," one said. And maybe that was her greatest act of rebellion. Not violence, but exposure. She hadn't drawn a blade or fired a gun. She'd turned words into weapons, paper into proof, truth as vengeance. Still, the fear persisted. One planter's wife wrote in her diary, "I dreamed again of her face, not the features, only the eyes. She was standing at my window with a candle, saying, 'You know what you signed.' I woke to find my husband burning our papers. Even now, that diary rests in the Mississippi State Archives, edges singed, ink faded, but the lines still legible. What happens when shame becomes a contagion no fire can destroy? The movement Dinah began was spreading beyond Mississippi, carried by rumor and reverence. North through the riverboats, east through the postal clerks who smuggled letters into abolitionist hands, west into territories not yet poisoned by law. Each retelling twisted a little, like folklore forming in real time. Some said she was half spirit, half woman. Others swore she'd been a teacher before her enslavement. educated in secret by a preacher who believed women could rewrite destiny. And in every version, one detail never changed. She made a cruel man laugh, and then took the sound away forever. What would you have done, standing in that square, watching a master mock a woman who refused to bow? Would you have laughed too, or looked away, like the rest? The echoes of that choice would ripple for years, because by 1843, one last public reckoning was about to shake Vicksburg again, and this time, it wouldn't be laughter that filled the air. It would be confession. Autumn, 1843. The air in Vicksburg smelled of river mud and rusted nails. The city's heart, its docks, had become a place of ghosts. Ships unloaded fewer bales, taverns echoed with fewer songs. The Whitmore family name was gone from ledgers and storefronts alike. Their grand estate had been sold for pennies on the dollar. And still, no one dared to speak the name Dinah Fitch above a whisper. Because she wasn't a ghost. She was a reckoning. That fall, a grand jury assembled to investigate what the newspapers delicately called the disturbances of '42. The presiding judge, a man named Harlan Pruitt, had known the Whitmores personally. He believed law could restore order to the chaos Dinah had left behind. But the courthouse, with its cracked plaster and mildew scent, seemed to mock that belief. At precisely 10 o'clock on the morning of October 5th, the bailiff called for silence. Then, from the back of the hall, a sound interrupted the proceedings. Soft, measured, like fabric brushing wood. A woman stepped forward, dressed plainly in gray, a widow's shawl, a face calm as a still pond. "I believe you're looking for me," she said. It took the crowd a full 10 seconds to understand who she was. Dinah Fitch, alive. Every throat in that room seemed to tighten at once. She carried no chains, no escort, just a folded paper in her hand. When the bailiff tried to stop her, she met his eyes and said quietly, "Do you really want to touch me?" He didn't move again. Stakes were no longer abstract. Every secret, every theft, every cruelty she'd recorded was about to meet daylight. The judge cleared his throat. "By what right do you enter this court?" "By the right of memory," she said, "and because no one else kept the books honest." Laughter broke out in the gallery, a nervous, brittle sound. Someone hissed, "Stop laughing." The phrase rippled through the benches like a spell remembered too late. Dinah unfolded her paper. "This is a copy of the Whitmore ledgers," she said, "signed by his own hand. You called me a liar, a thief, a savage, but his debt is written here. Every name he sold, every child taken, every promise broken." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough to bend the room. She placed the paper on the table in front of Judge Pruitt. "You wanted confession," she said. "So listen." Then she began to read, not the numbers, the names, one by one. Margaret, age 12, sold to New Orleans, October 10th. Benjamin, age 6, died en route. Mary Ellen, age 19, purchased freedom for her child and was whipped for the attempt. Her recitation lasted nearly 20 minutes. The clerk stopped writing. The judge's gavel trembled in his hand. At last, she reached the final line. "Dinah Fitch, property of Samuel Whitmore. Recovered cost? None." Silence pressed down like heat. That was the true ledger, the one no fire could burn. Then Dinah looked out over the gallery. "You think freedom comes from paper? No. It comes from what you do when someone writes your name on it." Someone in the back stood up. A woman, pale, trembling. "My father," she whispered, "was on that list." Dinah nodded. then you know what was owed. The judge ordered her removed, but no one moved to obey. The bailiff's hands hung useless at his sides. The townsfolk, those who had once laughed, now stared at her with the kind of respect reserved for storms. Outside, thunder rolled over the river. Dinah raised her chin, met every gaze in that room, and said the words that would later be carved into the courthouse doorframe by an unknown hand. If truth is a crime, then I plead guilty. They dragged her out, eventually. The records say she was detained overnight. No trial, no conviction. By morning, her cell was empty. The only thing left was her folded page, pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. On it, in that same precise handwriting, she'd written, "Ink sinks slower than blood." A week later, Judge Pruitt resigned. The sheriff left town, and in every corner of Vicksburg, people swore they saw gray figures by the riverbank, writing names in the mud with sticks. The line between legend and fact was already blurring. What had begun as a single act of defiance, a woman refusing to be humiliated, had become a movement of memory. Letters surfaced as far away as Charleston, New York, even London, all signed the same way. DF, every signature carried the same closing line: "Stop laughing." And yet one question lingered. If Dinah had escaped, where did she go next? Reports placed her heading north again, possibly toward abolitionist circles in Ohio. But there were others who believed something different, that she hadn't run at all, that she stayed hidden right there in Mississippi, helping others vanish through the very networks she'd exposed. The ink had turned into a map, the map into a legend. And before the story ended, that legend would demand one final witness, because the river was rising again, and this time it would bring everything buried back to the surface. Winter, 1844. The Mississippi lay half-frozen, its surface glinting like tarnished glass beneath the gray dawn. The riverboats moored at Vicksburg whistled in the cold, their smoke coiling into the clouds like prayers that never reached heaven. Beneath the docks, a fisherman swore he saw something moving in the current, a scrap of fabric, gray as morning cloth, vanishing under the ice. Some said it was nothing. Others whispered it was Dinah Fitch. The stakes hadn't vanished with her. They'd deepened, because power never forgives humiliation. It just waits for the next chance to restore itself. Sheriff Harland, successor to the disgraced Donovan, ordered the woman hunt reopened. "She's an outlaw," he declared, "and no outlaw mocks the law in my town." But by then, law itself had become a joke. Merchants refused to testify. Ledgers went missing. Witnesses forgot their stories. The name Dinah Fitch had turned from a person into a proverb, and proverbs cannot be arrested. Truth is heavier than iron. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the Vicksburg Gazette. No return address, just a single magnolia pressed inside. Beneath it, a letter written in careful hand. "You cannot hang what you never owned. You cannot silence what you refused to hear." DF, the editor printed it on the front page. Circulation doubled overnight. The same paper that had once called her a lunatic house servant now sold its best issue under her initials. By spring, whispers of Dinah's defiance reached beyond Mississippi. In Charleston, women repeated her speech like scripture. In New Orleans, a preacher compared her words to the Psalms. And on northern street corners, abolitionist pamphlets began quoting her line from the courthouse. "If truth is a crime, then I plead guilty." History, for once, was listening, but not everyone celebrated. One night, in a Baton Rouge tavern thick with cigar smoke and rum, Two men debated whether Dinah Fitch ever existed at all. A ghost story, one said. Cooked up by northern agitators. The other shook his head. Maybe, but I worked Whitmore land. I heard her speak. You don't forget that kind of fire. He tapped ash from his cigar and muttered, "Some women burn everything they touch, even after they're gone." Outside, thunder rolled across the river. Some fires never die. Years passed. The world changed, but the story stayed. Children of the enslaved told it by candlelight. How a woman once made a crowd of masters go silent. They called it the day the laughter stopped. In 1858, a letter surfaced in Ohio, addressed to a teacher named Ruth Freeman. Inside, a folded paper. "Teach them to read names out loud," it said. "That's how we stay alive." D.F. By the time the Civil War erupted, Dinah Fitch had become myth. A symbol whispered in campfires, painted on hidden banners, etched into tin cups by freedmen marching north. But those who'd known her, really known her, claimed something stranger. They said she hadn't died in the river at all, that she'd taken another name. Martha, or maybe Lydia, or Miss Fitch, the seamstress who kept ledgers no one dared to question. Every few years, another town claimed her sighting. A woman in gray teaching freed children in Memphis. A midwife in St. Louis with a scar across her wrist. A housekeeper in Chicago who refused wages but asked for ink and paper instead. Always gray, always quiet, always writing, and always leaving behind the same mark. 3 letters scratched into wood, glass, or paper. D.F. Truth doesn't drown. In 1903, demolition workers tearing down an old courthouse in Vicksburg found something wedged behind the foundation stone. A rusted nail, pinning a page that had somehow survived 60 years of damp and silence. On it, the same handwriting, the same precision. Ink sinks slower than blood. If you found this, you already know why. The artifact vanished before any historian could verify it. The foreman claimed a collector bought it for cash. Others said it was stolen by night. But a few months later, at a charity school in Chicago, a donation arrived in an unmarked envelope. Inside, $37, and a pressed magnolia blossom. Present-day legend says that on certain humid nights, when the river air smells of ink and iron, people still hear faint laughter along the old Vicksburg docks. Not cruel laughter, relieved laughter. The sound of someone who told the truth and survived it. Maybe Dinah Fitch was real, maybe she wasn't. But somewhere between those two possibilities lies the reason her story still burns. Because everyone, deep down, wants to watch a tyrant be unmasked by the one they thought powerless, the woman who refused to bow, the voice that made a town fall silent, the name history tried to erase but couldn't. Her echo still says it best. Stop laughing. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.